Well, good morning. That was a beautiful version of that song, don't you think? Man, what a great job they did. That's what we're talking about today. We're talking about saying what you need to say, or maybe it's better said, saying what you mean to say. Say what you need to say. Well, because it's hard to trust anybody in our culture. Wouldn't it be nice if people just said what should be said? But that doesn't really happen a lot in our society and in our culture, does it? It's hard to find people who really mean what they say. It's hard to find people whose word really is what they say it is. It's hard to find people that we can trust and who we can believe in, isn't it? Isn't it? All right. It's hard to find that, especially amongst the people that we should be able to trust the most, like our politicians, our elected officials, the people we've chosen to represent us. We have a hard time believing them, especially some of the people we're supposed to be able to trust. In fact, I heard this joke recently, and this is just a joke if you're an elected official, okay? It's just a joke. I heard this joke that a busload of politicians were headed to a convention somewhere, and they had to go off the road because of a detour, and so they ended up on this long, windy, curvy, dusty, dirt country road. And because of all that stuff, all those adjectives I just used, that I couldn't get to the word road, so I just used more adjectives there. Because of all that, they ended up crashing their bus into this tree in this old farmer's field. And about that same time, this old farmer came along and saw this gaping hole in his fence and went and investigated and saw that there's this bus of politicians that had crashed. So he went back to his truck and got his shovel and he buried all of the politicians. He buried all the politicians. Every other service laughed right there, and I had to tell them, that's not the joke. All right. Since the politicians never arrived at their destination, and they're important people, people were expecting them, the convention sent a state trooper to go look for them. So he backtracked where they had been, and he went down that long, dusty, windy, dirt country road and saw this gaping hole in the fence and saw where the bus had crashed and went and found the farmer who owned the land. And he said, "Do you know what happened here?" And the farmer said, "Yeah, there's a bunch of politicians. They crashed. And so I buried them all." And the farmer said, "Were they all dead?" And the old farmer replied, "Well, some of them kept saying they weren't, but you know how them politicians lie." It's hard to trust anybody. That's why we have to swear on all these things and have all these legal contracts in order for people to learn that they can trust us. And I've heard people swear about all sorts of things. As a kid, I heard people cross their heart and hope to die. I've heard people swear on their mother's grave and on their kids' lives and on their own life. And the assumption is that the more we kind of put up as collateral in our swearing, the more of a guarantee it is that we're going to make good on our agreement, that we're really telling the truth. But the problem in our society, like I've been talking about, is we don't trust people's word even when they make great guarantees of what they're swearing by, do we? We don't really trust people. Because we've seen court TV too much, or we've seen whatever, where people will put their hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then they'll lie through their teeth. We're skeptical and cynical because we've been burned. And we're also skeptical and cynical because we've lied to other people, and we know how much we lie to other people, and we know that other people do the same thing to us. That's why Jesus says what he says in Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 33, that we're going to be looking at today. If you want to take your Bible and open up to Matthew chapter 5 or your smartphone or whatever you have, Matthew's the first book of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 33. We've been in this series called Lost in Translation, where we just kind of been looking at some of the hard sayings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7. Over the course of 2,000 years, sometimes we lose the meaning or the application of certain sayings that Jesus gives us. And it's important to kind of go back and discover what those are. So we've been looking at that. We're going to be looking at why Jesus says what he says in Matthew 5:33 through 37 and how it applies to our life. But he said it to his culture, but it could just as much apply to our culture, what he says in this passage. So it's important to understand. Here's what he says, Matthew 5:33. Jesus says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord.' But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. And what we know from Matthew chapter 5 and the whole Sermon on the Mount is that, and from a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets, is that Jesus has kind of given us a new law, a new way of doing things in God's new kingdom here. Just like Moses, who God gave the law to, went up on a mountaintop to get the law. Jesus in Matthew 5 goes up on a hillside to kind of give us this new law. Just like the prophets called God's people back to God, Jesus is acting as a prophet, calling God's people back to God here in this passage. And so in this passage so far in Matthew 5, he's been taking all these old laws that they had, that God had given them through Moses, and he's kind of reinterpreting it because they had taken these good laws that God had given them and perverted them or twisted them for their own benefit and for their own gain. And so he's been saying, you have heard that it was said, blank, but I say unto you, and it's the same thing he does here. And we're just going to walk through verses 33 through 37 here, and at the end of that, I'm going to apply it to our lives a little bit more. But in verse 33, Jesus just said, you've heard that it was said, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. And we can see here that oaths and swearing and making vows haven't always been bad. In fact, it was given allowance for in the law. In fact, there were certain rules that God gave for swearing. You were supposed to swear by God's name. And if you swore by God's name, it was a holy name. If you swore by God's name and you broke that oath that you made or that covenant that you made, then you were subject to God's judgment. God is the arbiter and the judge and the executioner of whatever comes out of that covenant. So when you swear by God, it's a serious deal, and you're supposed to keep your word. The original intention here is for God's people to live in truth. God wanted them to be people of truth because God gives us the truth, and God is truth. He's the ultimate truth in the universe. He wanted his people to be different from all the nations around them that were lying and backbiting and exploiting people for their own gain. That's what it was originally for. It was a good thing that God gave them. And if you broke that covenant, you were profaning or taking the Lord's name in vain, which is a direct violation of the third commandment. Do not take the Lord's name in vain, because you were acting opposite of how God would act in God's character. That was the original intention of what the law was all about. But here's what the Israelites had done. They had done what they always do and what we always do. They had taken what God had given them. They had expanded it so that it had all these other rules. There was this huge section of the law book just devoted to how to make an oath or a vow, or how to swear a covenant. And they were using it for their own benefit. See, the reason Jesus says, don't swear by heaven or Jerusalem or the earth or your own head, they would swear by the temple, they would swear by all kinds of things, is because they had figured out, or they had figured in their own minds that if they swear by God's name, they knew that was serious. But if they swore by something a little bit less than that, it wasn't quite as serious. And they weren't held to quite the same standard. And what they did was they perverted it, and they ended up using the oaths as kind of loopholes and ways to exploit other people. Just like we do with our legal contracts, I think a lot of times. I don't think this is much different in our society. We just don't use oaths. We use legal contracts, and we go to the courts and have lawyers and judges do all this stuff for us. But when you sign a legal contract, aren't you just hoping that you're not signing something that you don't really know what you're signing? You're just like holding your breath because they got 30 pages of fine print and you don't want to read all that fine print. So you're just signing going, I hope they're not about to take advantage of me. Anybody ever feel like that? That's kind of how it was for them too. That's what it became for them, because every contract or oath had a loophole. Here's just a few examples. One rabbi wrote that if you swear by the city of Jerusalem, you don't have to keep your oath. But if you swear toward Jerusalem, you are bound by your oath. See how that can be confusing? So someone might make an oath with someone and say, well, I swear by Jerusalem. And that person would think, wow, that's pretty big. But really, it meant nothing. They were playing all these games. In fact, Jesus calls them out in Matthew chapter 23, starting with verse 16, for doing this exact same thing. Matthew 23:16, he says, woe to you, blind guides. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. And you see the little differentiation there. You had to know the law perfectly in order to interpret this, kind of like, we have now. So they would swear by the temple, and someone would say, wow, that's big, but they really didn't mean it. Jesus is calling them out for that. He says, you blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? They had used this elaborate system to exploit other people for their own gain. And it become about loopholes and not keeping your promises as much as it had been about keeping your oaths and your promises, which is why Jesus says what he says in verse 34, when he says this. He says, but I tell you, do not swear at all. You've heard that was said, but y'all perverted it so much. Let's just get rid of that whole system. Don't swear at all. Either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. Like I said, they had these different ways of kind of lessening what they were swearing by, but Jesus said that doesn't even matter anymore. Let's just get rid of that system. You think you're swearing by heaven or by Jerusalem or by earth or by your own head, so that makes the covenant less? Don't you know that heaven is God's, that the earth is God's, that Jerusalem is the city of the great king, that even your own head, you don't control what hairs are white or black? We wish we did. Maybe our kids control what hairs turn white or black, but you don't even control that. God controls that. So even though you think you're getting around this whole swearing by an oath thing, you're actually stuck swearing by the Lord's name because it's all the Lord's. And so the Lord is still the judge and the arbiter of that covenant. You just think he isn't. So you're still held to the same standard. He said, you're not tricking anybody. You're not fooling God. Don't swear at all. Here's what he was really saying. As the people of God, especially for us as followers of Jesus Christ, John 1:14 tells us that Jesus is full of grace and truth. Jesus says that he's the way, the truth, and the life. Especially as followers of Jesus, we live in truth. The truth is not just something we just tell to others. We live in truth. And when you live in truth, in God's kingdom, in God's way of doing things where it's all light and no darkness, when you live in truth, oaths don't matter anymore. Vows and swearing covenants are superfluous. They don't matter because your word is what matters. Because we're people who live in truth and tell the truth and speak the truth and uphold our word to other people. It doesn't matter anymore, which is basically why Jesus said what he said in verse 37. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Jesus said, just say yes or no and mean it, really mean it. And anything other than that gets involved in this huge, elaborate system that y'all have set up, and I don't have anything to do with that mess. That's not me. Just say yes or no. So what does that mean for us? Does that mean that we should never swear at all? Does that mean that we shouldn't make vows in our marriage ceremonies? Does that mean that we shouldn't put our hand on the Bible? Does that mean that we shouldn't be sworn into office? Does that mean that we shouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance? Does that mean that we shouldn't enter into any legal contracts with anybody? Some people would say yes to that. I would say not necessarily. This is like almost anything Jesus said. It's more about our hearts than it is about don't make any covenants. Don't swear at all. It's more about our hearts. He wants us to live in truth. Sometimes we have to enter into those sorts of things in our society because we live in a society full of falsehood where people can't trust one another. So you just have to do certain things. It's not a bad thing to say vows to the person you're getting married to. We have to do some of that so that people will trust us and gain trust in us. But if that's what we're basing our word off of, then we've already lost and we're not living in truth. In other words, if you tell the truth because you don't want to go to jail, if you're on the witness stand, if you tell the truth because you don't want to go to jail, you don't want to perjure yourself, that's not a reason to tell the truth. You should be telling the truth because we're people of truth and we serve a God who is truth, full of truth. If you have to rely on an oath to say, okay, I better really keep my word now, then we're not living in truth. Live in truth. Jesus isn't necessarily against oaths. He just wants us to live in truth and be people of our word and be people who reflect the character of God and the trustworthiness of God. If I were to boil it all down and kind of put it on Twitter, this is how I would say it. Jesus says that our word matters more than our words. Your word matters more than your words in the kingdom of God. In fact, if people can't trust your word, then your words are meaningless. It doesn't really matter what you say if people can't trust who you are, if you're not a trustworthy person, if you're not a person who lives in truth. All those words that they spoke didn't really matter if they weren't people of truth. And this just didn't go away just because Jesus said it. The early church, the New Testament church, struggled with it too. James 5:12 says it. James has to say it to the new church again. He says, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven, nor by earth, nor by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. Your word matters more than your words. We live in the light of God's truth. Some of us need to really get a hold of that this morning in our lives because we're so deep in falsehood. We're so deep in untruth. We need to let the light of God's truth shine in there and kind of reveal some things and start living in truth. So how do we do that? Well, first off, we have to live in truth with who God is. We have to live in truth with who God is. And that's character. Because the more we get to know of who God is, the more God tells us who he is, and the more we get to know that, the more he forms our character to look like his character, to look like Jesus and how Jesus looked. The more we begin to become like him. He forms our character. You know, they say there's no atheist in a foxhole. You ever heard somebody say that? There's no atheist in a foxhole. But I think there's a lot of atheists, at least practical atheists, in our churches. People who say we believe, but then we live as if God didn't exist at all. When we get in trouble, when we're in that foxhole, we go, oh, we're all ready to swear something. You know, God, please, God, if you would only do this, God, if you'll do this, then I'm going to do this. We're ready to make a deal at that point. But when we get out of that, it's like, well, we just kind of forget about it. We move on. Listen, God is holy and just. He doesn't forget. He's perfectly righteous. His judgments are true. He's also gracious and merciful and faithful and loving and kind and patient. The more we understand who he is, the more we get to know him, the more he forms those things in us. And then when we get out of line with that, he brings us back in line with those things. There's a lot of us, I think, we're trying to lie to God as if you could. God, you know what? I just did that because, well, you would understand, God, when this happened, then here's a lie I think a lot of us tell to God. God, tomorrow I'm going to start reading the Bible. Tomorrow, God, I'm going to get back in my prayer time. I promise you that, God. And then tomorrow comes. And then the next day and the next day. We're trying to lie to God. What if we just said something like this? What if we said what we really meant? God, you know what? I'm terrible at reading the Bible. I'm terrible at having a prayer time every day. I need you to help me with that. And I'd like to start right now. Or I need you to help me with that. I'm going to set my alarm for tomorrow morning. I need you to help me get up. And then maybe you do it and maybe you miss it. Instead of going, God, okay, I'm going to do better tomorrow. Here's what you say. God, see how bad I am at that? I'm terrible at it, I told you. I need you to help me do this right now or tomorrow or whenever it is. Let's just come to God as we are. There's no pretense or falsehood when we come to God. He already knows us. Live in the truth of who God is, and he'll form our character. And as he forms our character and we become more Christ-like, guess what? We begin to become more like who he originally created us to be. We begin to become more of who he wants us to be. And that's the second thing. We need to live in the truth of who God is, and we need to live in the truth of who we are. Or live in the truth of who we've been created to be. That's integrity. I think a lot of people, when they think of integrity, they think of doing the right thing when no one is looking. But I think integrity is a lot more than that. I think really integrity is living in the truth of who we are and who we've been created to be all the time. Because when we're being who we've been created to be, then we're being true to who we are. And there's really no better way to live than that, is there? No better way to live than in the truth of who we are. Remember what John 8:31 through 32 tells us? Jesus says, if you know the truth will what? Set you free. So how come so many of us live so bound up and not free? It's because we don't live in truth. We live in the falsehood of who other people think we are. Or we live in the images of who we think we are or who we think we're supposed to be. But here's the deal with images. Images are by definition not real. They're false. They're a representation of something that is real. They're not real. So guess what? You're not who you think you are. You're not who you think other people think you are. Those are all false images. That's not you. The only way to get to know who you are and who you've been created to be is to get to know the Creator more and more and more. And when you live in the truth of who he is, guess what? You start living in the truth of who you really are. And that's freedom. Don't you get tired of trying to be who other people want you to be? Don't you get tired of faking it? I do. I think we fake it all the time. We fake it at our workplace. We try to be who other people think we should be, or who we think other people think we should be, or who we think we should be. We fake it with our families. We fake it with our friends. We fake it in our schools. We fake it at church, don't we? Listen, God didn't create you to be me and do what I do. God created you to be you and do what you do in the church and in the body of Christ. Do that. Get tired of faking it. You know what I do? Here's what I do. I end up, because I want to please people and I want to be who other people want me to be, and I try to live into that, I end up over-promising and under-delivering. That's the worst thing you could possibly do. I end up over-promising and under-delivering. And I'm not faithful to my word when I do that. My integrity is not there. When I'm living in that false image, that's not solid. There's nothing solid about that. There's no integrity in that. But when I'm living in who God wants me to be, there's something solid there. There's some integrity. I can do that. But I overpromise and I underdeliver. And so in order to kind of try to deliver on this promise, I'll give up time with my family. Or I won't spend as much time working on my sermon. Or I won't spend as much time doing the things that God specifically called and gifted and equipped me to do, because I'm trying to live up to this promise that I've made, because I want to be who this person wants me to be. That's a terrible way to live. We all do it. What if we could just be, what if we had the courage to be us? God's done so much to bring you to this moment. Don't dishonor it by trying to be someone you're not. And dishonor all that work by trying to be someone you're not. What if we had the courage to be us? A guy named Chris Herron was here recently speaking to our youth in this area, and I loved what he said. He was in ESPN's 30 for 30 film called Unguarded. He was in the NBA, did tons of drugs, deep into the drug culture, even while he's playing in the NBA. And he ended up coming. He ended up getting out of that through God's help and some other people's help. And here's what he said about addiction. And I think it applies on a larger level to almost every single one of us. He said, what is it that you don't like about yourself that you're trying to be someone different by doing drugs or by drinking? What is it that you don't like about yourself that you're trying to be someone different by doing the things that you do? And that resonated so clearly with me because the reason I got into all that stuff is because I liked who I was when I was high a whole lot better than I liked who I was when I wasn't. I didn't like who I was. You know what? If you're there, you don't really like who you are. Here's what I tell you. That's awesome. That may sound weird. Because all those insecurities, all those fears, all that guilt and all that shame and all that hurt and all that pain, God didn't cause that. God doesn't want that. That's your old life. Here's what he wants you to do. Put off that old life and walk into his new life. You live in truth of who you are and who you've been created to be. And you don't have to deal as much with all that old stuff anymore because you're a new person. We'll talk about that in a second. What is it that you don't like about yourself that you keep on telling yourself those same old lies? What if we could be ourselves? By the way, this is what authentic Christian community helps us do. It helps us to be ourselves. That's why you should be in a small group, because you could be around other people who are just as broken and just as in need of people to tell them the truth as you are. That's why small groups are important. Live in the truth of who you are and who you've been created to be. And then finally, live in the truth of your word with others. Colossians 3:9-10 says, do not lie to each other. Really, that word is do not be false to one another. Don't represent yourself falsely, and don't represent what you're able to do for others falsely. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, all that other stuff, since you've taken off that old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Notice it's being renewed in knowledge in the image of his creator. The more we get to know who God is, the more we become who he's created us to be. The more we become who he's created us to be, the more faithful we can be to our word. The more we don't overpromise and underdeliver. We tell people exactly who we are. We represent who we've been created to be just right. We live in the truth of our word with others. We don't say we can do more than we can. We don't represent ourselves falsely. Listen, as Christians, we don't exploit others for our gain. As people of God living in the truth of who he is and who we are, we don't lie to the IRS. We don't lie in business deals for our own gain, for our own good. We live in truth. Because if we're not faithful to our word, then what does that say about God? If we're not faithful to the promises we've made as his followers, then what does that say about him being faithful to his promises? And what does that say about us as a community? You're not just representing yourself, you're representing all of us and representing God. We live in truth. Now, that doesn't mean we just say whatever whatever comes to our mind. Some people say that. They say something rude or hurtful, and they just say, well, I'm just being honest. That's not living in truth. That's being hurtful and dumb. We speak the truth in love. That means we build a relationship, and when people know we care, then they'll be able to receive the truth a whole lot better. We speak the truth in love. But we live in the truth of our word with others. That's who we are. That's what we do. It's what we're about. Your word matters more than your words. It determines what kind of person you are and how others view you and God. Everything we say should be an oath. Everything we say should be an oath. When you say, yes, I'll do something, whether you had a contract or not, you should do it. When you're speaking, whether you swore on the Bible or not, you should tell the truth. He's calling us to live far beyond any law. Everything we say is just as solemn as if we had said, I swear by God before it. The fact that we swear an oath isn't what makes us truthful. The fact that we're sons and daughters of God is what makes us truthful, people of truth who live in the truth of who he is of who we are in our word to other people. And the truth will set us free. I'm going to call those helping with communion to go ahead and come on up. And as they come, when you come to this table, this is not a Methodist table, this is God's table, and you're welcome to it if you want Jesus. You're seeking him. But just know when you come, you're coming to truth. When you come to the cross, you're coming to the truth. So when you come, let God illuminate all those dark places where we're living in falsehood. And let him deal with you in that. Let him bring him to the light and deal in truth so we can live in truth.
Thank you for listening to our message today. I hope that you've been inspired to act upon what you've just heard and become a doer of the word. Feel free to contact us through the information on the screen or through our website. Better yet, if you're ever in the Niceville, Florida area, feel free to stop by and visit us at the Niceville United Methodist Church.